All right, so today we're going to talk about Eastern Europe. So in the last lesson, we talked about the fall of the Soviet Union itself and how that, tension within the Soviet Union from glasnost, perestroika, democratization really helped lead to the collapse of the USSR. And when that happens, we see a lot of repercussions, reverberations around the rest of the world and the rest of Europe in particular. So let's talk about this. We're gonna hit a variety of different areas here because really most areas as part of the Warsaw Pact struggled as a result of the collapse of the USSR. So the areas we're going to focus on today are going to be Czechoslovakia, Germany, Yugoslavia, Romania, and Poland. So most of our Eastern European nations. First up on the agenda list though is Poland. So the situation in Poland is, it's rough. Before the fall of the Soviet Union, saw the rise of a new political organization called Solidarity. It was a labor union that was looking to improve working conditions for the average worker in the Soviet Union's controlled areas. And they were looking for recognition by the government, led by a man named Lech Walesa, who really put a lot of pressure on the USSR to make significant reforms in how they were allowing people to, make decisions on their own businesses and really just the economy as a whole. So, in response to this, exerted pressure on the new government, the Soviet Union encouraged the Polish government to stomp out solidarity by using martial law in the military. And all of this is just really going to come to a head at the fall of the Soviet Union. When it fails, it leads to this, growing popular movement looking for reform in Poland. And at first, they don't get it. So what we see is the arrival of General Jaruzelski, who will become a military dictator in Poland, who, while he legalizes Solidarity's existence as a workers' union and agrees to a free election, is not exactly the world's most amicable leader, particularly after the fall of the USSR. I mean, he was a military dictator. Well, after the free elections take place, Walesa is elected as the new leader of Poland, and Walesa is going to institute the same policy that Boris Yeltsin did in the now different Russian Republic, and that is the whole shock therapy situation. And it's going to have the exact same results in Poland as it did in the USSR. We're going to see mass inflation throughout the economy. Prices of goods skyrocket, and unemployment reaches levels that it hadn't seen in decades. So all of this is going to lead to Poland transitioning again from a military dictatorship to this democratically elected Walesa to now a communist leader who's going to really kind of push Poland back to the situation they were in the 70s and 80s. So it just doesn't work. Shock therapy is a disaster for every nation that attempts to use it. This quick transition from communism to capitalism is ineffective. But we're going to see numerous different nations attempt to institute it, thinking that this is the best thing possible for them, when in reality, it just leads to instability, inflation, and high unemployment. All right, so this is, yeah, bad moment. Stupid people not realizing what's going on here. So after we see the election of Alexander Kwasniewski, who becomes the new communist leader in Poland, he's actually going to make some significant changes in Poland as well too. Poland's going to work a lot harder to becoming more active in the European community itself. Will become a member of NATO, which is important for their security. And the reality is Poland is a step ahead of where they were at the beginning of the 1990s, but there's still rampant corruption in the government. Kwasniewski is, not capable of kind of stemming the tide of corruption that exists. And today we see two different leaders, the Kaczynski brothers, who are the president and prime minister. They are attempting to make some changes, but governmental corruption is kind of how the game works right now in Poland. So we'll see how this plays out in the next 10 to 15 years too. All right, situation in Germany is a bit different. So if you remember right, Germany was divided into two nations throughout the Cold War, in Eastern and West Germany. Well, at the end of the Soviet Union, you see East Germany is kind of just in a terrible situation. West Germany has been thriving for the last 30 to 40 years with the help of their allies in Britain and France and other nations. And East Germany has been insulated from that progress. And a lot of this has to do with the existence of the various fortifications and walls that separate both the city of Berlin or East Berlin from West Berlin, and then also Germany itself being blocked off. So, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, we started to see a little bit of integration between the east and the west sides, and unfortunately, this is going to really upset the East German leaders who are going to attempt to cut that off again. So they will stop any sort of immigration from one side to the next as people started fleeing from East Berlin into West Berlin, then eventually from East Germany into West Germany. We started seeing less and less power and responsibility in the leadership of East Germany. So we will actually see eventually just a move towards reintegration of the two sides. Egon Krenz is going to open up everything. The Berlin Wall will finally be completely destroyed, and the East German Communist Party will disappear. Interestingly enough, Krenz himself will actually go to jail for, killing someone. So that's, different. We don't really see that all that often in politics where a political leader is, in jail for murder. Well, this leads us to what happens with the reunification of Germany. It will become reunified into one nation, but unfortunately, there was really very little um, safeguards put in place right at the beginning. They were two very different countries over the course of the last 50 years. The situation is that West Germany is much more advanced than East Germany is right now. Unemployment in East Germany was anywhere from 20 to 35%, depending on the area that you were in. And this led to people just immigrating out of the area itself, which left to cities and factories abandoned. Unemployment just really kept them from making progress towards stabilizing the nation. The economy itself was largely due to the industrial complexes established in West Germany. And you still very much see that split today if you ever travel to Germany. West Germany is just in a much better shape than East Germany is, as they're still trying to fully reintegrate the two different areas together, even 29 years after that separation ceased to exist. But Germany does make progress. Eventually, they will join the European Union, and today they are generally considered one of the 2 or 3 most important nations in the European Union, along with France, since we've now seen the slow, painful removal of Britain from the European Union as well. So they've made progress. Germany has just been a long, hard road since the fall of the Soviet Union to really integrate those two portions of the nations under one government that represents them both equally. All right, Czechoslovakia. So this is a situation where it's just not a smooth ride as well. At first, the country is doing relatively good after the fall of the Soviet Union. There's a conservative government led by Milo Yaques who resists change, but eventually the people actually, pick up their voice for the first time, begin a ton of protests asking for democratic change within the government. First, it's 10,000 people talking about democracy, then it becomes 25,000 people, then 500,000 people in Prague itself that forces Yaques to resign, and they will get a new president by the name of Václav Havel. And that's when the other shoe drops, because Havel does the same thing as a lot of these other nations do at the end of the USSR. They institute a policy of shock therapy, and we see the Czechoslovakian economy fall off a cliff. Unemployment skyrockets again. And what's interesting about this is that the shock therapy really only hurted the portion of the nation that we called Slovakia. The Czech portion of it actually does quite well after the situation because of the city of Prague and how that provided some stability for the rest of the economy. So this creates a bit of a divide between the two areas. Unable to agree on any economic policy during this, eventually the two sides drift farther and farther apart. And in 1993, they will actually split into two different pieces. We have in the West Czech Republic. In that portion of it, you do have the city of Prague, and for the most part, they have done pretty well for themselves since the split in 1993. The Czech Republic has, relatively limited unemployment. They are fully immersed in the European Union. Everything else, things are in pretty good shape. Unfortunately, that is not the same case for Slovakia. much higher rates of unemployment. Inflation has been persistently an issue for over the last 25 years. And they just never really have gotten the ball rolling since then in comparison to their Czech Republic counterpart. So we again have some rough situations here. All right, so let's move on to Romania. So Romania is a bit of an oddball when it comes to Europe. There just isn't that much in Romania that's gonna really stabilize the nation as well. Like when we go to Romania today, you can go see this wonderful castle of Count Dracula, which, cool. But beyond that, there isn't that much economic opportunity for the people. So, as of 1989, they are still very much, living in the product of the Cold War. So, 1989, the Cold War ends. They haven't industrialized or anything in the last 30 to 40 years, and the leader of Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu, is a brutal communist dictator. And as people attempt to reform and make changes, you just see him massacring hundreds upon hundreds of people. And eventually, he and his wife are forced to run out of the country and escape, but they're caught on the way out, tried for crimes against the people, and eventually executed for it. So you would think this would be a great step in the right direction, but unfortunately, the Romanian economy is just an utter disaster. It was corrupt in the 1990s under Ceausescu and then the leadership afterwards. And what we actually see is when 2000 comes around, the economy is producing less than what it was in the 1980s. So they've actually taken a step backwards during this time period. Their attempts to introduce capitalism just don't work. And in fact, they actually moved back towards a more government controlled socialist, borderline communist mentality over the course of the 1990s. And the reality is that there's incredible corruption in the country, largely due to the Russian mafia, which still has a very, very strong presence in there. As many of the leaders of the mafia have been pushed out of Russia itself due to much stronger government control in that area, they have kind of fled to Romania, where they deal in human trafficking, illegal weapons trades, drugs, everything else. And the buying and selling of politicians in this area has really kind of limited Romania's ability to make any sort of substantive change towards a more modern, legitimate democracy. And then we get to Yugoslavia. So you can look at this map right here. Yugoslavia is this hodgepodge of what we would consider now 6 different nations, but at the time of the Soviet Union's fall was one unified people. They were under the control of a man named Commodore Tito, and they were pretty peaceful. People actually loved Tito for the most part, even though he was a communist dictator. But unfortunately, he dies. And when he dies, he's replaced by a series of terrible leaders that are only going to make the situation worse due to the incredible nationalism that comes out of this area. Remember, this is still the same area that started World War I. The nationalist concerns that existed at the beginning of the 20th century are still there at the end of the 20th century as well. There are a ton of different ethnic groups in this area. Serbians, Croats, the Slovenes, Macedonians, Albanians, Hungarians, Montenegrins, and then you have a small group of people who are Bosnian Muslims as well too. And what we have here is a leader who's going to build his entire political platform on the persecution of a specific group of people. His name is Slobodan Milosevic. He is a Serbian who will be elected as the leader of Yugoslavia, and he brings this really hard nationalist platform to Yugoslavia. And the other different ethnic groups that are contained within this are immediately going to see this guy as a threat, and many of them leave. And we will start to see different areas within Yugoslavia attempt to break away from Yugoslavia because of the nationalist platform that Milosevic brings. So places like Slovenia and Croatia will declare their own independence, and this just brings disaster for those left behind. Milosevic will begin a policy of ethnic cleansing, where he attempts to wipe from Yugoslavia the Bosnian Serbs who are also pushing for their own independence, and particularly the Muslim minority within them. So he begins what we would just consider a modern day genocide of attempting to wipe them off the planet as quickly as possible, and this is just a disaster. The Bosnians themselves, in an attempt to try to have a voiced opinion in this whole Yugoslavian mess, will create this three-person presidency they thought would help balance the power, but only makes them more incapable of making any sort of decision within the nation itself. And everything continues to unroll. Sorry. The ethnic Albanians will now start fighting against the Serbian military as well, and eventually the United Nations itself will have to get involved, and this will lead to the United Nations carrying out peacekeeping missions in Yugoslavia to prevent the eradication of the Muslim populations of the Albanians and really anyone who stood up against the Serbian military. And this will eventually just lead to the fracturing of the nation. So we'd already talked about Croatia wanting to break away and Slovenia doing so. Then eventually Montenegro will also expel themselves from Yugoslavia, and the nation itself is just going to be broken into those 6 pieces. The Serbians will accept the peace led by Bosnia Herzegovina, and then the Montenegrins all breaking away. And at the end of the day, sorry, I skipped ahead. Slobodan Milosevic will be held on trial for committing crimes against humanity because of the way he treated the Bosnian Serbs and everyone else. In fact, today in the world, the second largest population of Bosnian peoples is actually here in St. Louis because they immigrated out of the nation and received asylum here in the United States as refugees from the persecution that they had. So that kind of wraps up the situation of all the different ethnic groups and the various different European nations after the fall of the Soviet Union. And we really just briefly covered a lot of this stuff because time is kind of the essence at this point. We just don't have a lot of opportunity to go into depth for a lot of these. One last thing I did want to mention out of this, though, is even though we've seen these political movements and these changes in Eastern European take place, we also see some philosophical movements pop up in the 1990s and early 2000s in Europe as well, including existentialism, which if you watch some of the videos that are online about existentialism, you'll see that, it really is a very unique approach to understanding the world around you. And we also see 2 other driving movements in Europe during this time period, which is environmentalism and consumerism in the 1990s and early 2000s, as certain European nations become more and more ecologically conscious as to what's going on. And this is going to lead to a direct conflict with the consumer mentality that has really encapsulated the Western world about buying something new every other week in order to better live your life. And this controversy still is very prominent in Europe today, particularly the Northern European nations who are very acutely aware of what's happening with the creation of more and more goods and how that's having an impact on, where do we throw away everything else and how the climate itself is changing to adjust. All right, if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.